Hello, I'm Anawiltus, and today I'm going to be talking about why I do not believe that anarcho-communism could ever be achievable in any sense. And the reason why I do not believe it would be achievable has to do a bit with supply and demand, really. So, in a capitalist society, the movement is largely motivated by demand. So, for example, let's take medical professionals and let's take an urban and a rural dichotomy. Now, normally, one would expect that individuals would prefer to live in an urban area because there's a higher population density, which means that there is, number one, a greater diversity of amenities, and also, on the second hand, a greater number of potential customers. And for a medical professional, this is directly linked with the population in an area, which is why I'm using this as the example. Now, then, you take in a rural area, the population is more sparse, and there's going to be a less variety of amenities, so an individual would be less likely to work there. However, how this is balanced out in a capitalist system is that you take the wealth of an urban area and the wealth of a rural area, and then you divide it by competition, and that would be the number of medical professionals in those areas. So if we assume that medical professionals would naturally want to move to urban areas first, we put a bunch of medical professionals in the urban areas, and then eventually the division will come up to a point where the demand, or the amount that people are willing to pay for medical professionals in the rural area rises above that than in the urban area, and then medical professionals will move out in the rural area. And usually this also helps balance it out, because in a rural area there's obviously less people, so a single doctor would be able to service a wider territory than in an urban area where there's more people, and therefore you actually need a higher density of medical professionals as well. Now, now let's take an anarcho-communist system. In an anarcho-communist system, now, of course, you eliminate a few things here. And what you eliminate is competition. And as I mentioned earlier, competition is what would drive someone to move from an area that has more amenities to an area that has less amenities. So if there's no competition, what reason would a doctor have to move into an area where there's less amenities, such as a rural area? And in fact, living in an urban area might even be advantageous in the sense of having a higher density of doctors. And the reason why that would be advantageous is because if there's more doctors, then there's less work to do. Now, you may say, well, under a communist principle, then obviously some doctors would have to move out in a rural area in order to balance out the services. Because the economy is not just goods, it is also services. So even if goods are equally distributed, services should also be equally distributed. But then you have a conflict here. And the conflict is that these medical professionals want to live in the urban area, and they have no particular reason to move out into the rural area. And now they have to move into the rural area because of the system. And therefore, at this point, they are now becoming oppressed. And this wouldn't just happen with medical professionals. This would happen with architects, engineers, and various other specialists that you would not expect to necessarily be very common in the rural area. So you end up having a wide scale oppression. But remember, this is an anarchist society, so who's going to be the oppressor? And and that's where it all falls apart, really. It falls apart because now at first you may say that distributing goods might be something that could be accomplished, uh, but even then you'd already have to oppress people to get them to do that in the first place, and now you have to oppress people to get them to move places, which is interesting because in a capitalist society you don't have to oppress the doctors to move out into the countryside because they'll naturally do that because of supply and demand. But now the doctors, they're not looking for demand. What they're looking for is supply, and which is the various amenities. Since they're getting them for free, since it's a communist society, then obviously people would want to move to the places where they can get the most stuff for free, and that would be the urban areas. And you might say, well, we're trying to distribute it equally, but let's be honest, that's the logistics of that would be very difficult, especially if you have no central planning. And therefore, uh, what I'm essentially saying here is that because of the issues of supply and demand, the only way to force individuals to, the only way to get individuals to equally spread supply of not only goods but also services is to oppress them in some way. And then the only way to do that would be, well, theoretically, you could have mobs uh, just at get just chasing professionals out of towns when there's too many. But honestly, who's going to have the oversight on when to do that? And who's going to be the one deciding when that is necessary? And that's going to be a very difficult thing. So essentially, what you end up having to do is central planning, or at least regional planning, and therefore you have to abandon the anarchist system in order to uphold the communist system. And this is what people say all the time, that communism is not compatible with anarchism, even though theoretically speaking, uh, many communist viewpoints do want to end up in an anarchist place. And what this ends up meaning is that the problem is not with necessarily the system, because theoretically speaking, if everybody were enthusiastic about it, it would actually work. I'm not going to lie. It would work if everybody were completely enthusiastic about it. If everyone was a hardcore communist and believed it and was willing to work together, it would work. But the problem is the people don't want to work together, and they don't necessarily want to make it work. And there are people that are greedy, not necessarily for money, but also perhaps for other things as well. So what you end up having is a problem with the people. And what we see in history is that communists and socialists have recognized that this is in fact the case. And this is why, and here we go, and this is why there's been so many millions upon millions of people that have died under communist regimes. It's not because the regimes were intending to turn tyrannical and to execute millions upon millions of people. It's because they realized that the people themselves were incompatible with the political philosophy that they were trying to enact. In other words, when people say that socialism has never been tried and that communism has never been tried, they're actually incorrect. What has happened is that people have tried, and then they have realized that humans themselves are incompatible with the system that they're trying to enact. Therefore, they have to try to eliminate people in order to get the system to work. And you end up having the problem of how many people do I need to eliminate? Which people do I need to eliminate? How many people will have to die until I have the right set of people that will actually get my political system to work? And how many people do I have to kill until I don't need a government to force redistribution? That's essentially the question that anarcho-communists would have to ask, because otherwise their system could never possibly be implemented. How many people would I have to kill until I don't need to oppress people to get them to comply with the system? And unfortunately, it's the answer has never been found. And that is why people to this day keep dying to socialism, or at least the attempted implementation of it, which has never been fully actualized, because it simply is not compatible with human nature. And then one might ask, okay, well, are you sure? Are you sure that communism hasn't actually never been tried? And the question, I think my response to that would be, have you ever tried to fly? And not just in an airplane or in some device, just on your own human body. You just try to fly, and so you may be able to jump. You may be able to jump very high. You may be able to jump off things. You may be able to dive off things. But can you actually fly using only the human body? And it turns out that the answer is no. But you can still jump, and people can say, I could say, I'm trying to fly, and I can flap my arms around, and I can jump around, and people, and then people can accuse me saying, well, he hasn't actually tried to fly since it didn't work. And the question I would have is, if the only way for you to say that your system has actually been attempted is for it to actually have been fully implemented, aren't you assuming that your system is possible? Isn't there an assumption snuck in there that the system is actually possible, and that the system is actually workable, and that there will not be a major impediment to getting the system on the ground? There's an assumption that for a system to be tried, it needs to fully reach point B from point A, but the assumption made is that there should not be any problem with the distance between point A and point B, when in fact it may be an insurmountable gap. But there you go. So that's why I think that anarcho-communism can never really be implemented, and why socialism in general has failed, and why complete redistribution of wealth and services, and goods and services, would always have to be oppressive. It's simply because if people aren't looking for demand, what they'll be looking for is supply. And if they can't find, and if you won't give them the supply, then there you go. And you may say, well, what if we equally distribute supply? What if we actually make it work by equally distributing the supply? And still, you have a problem of who's going to organize this. Because in an anarchist system, this is not something that you would be able to organize simply by virtue of the fact that the system is anarchist, unless you're actually not an anarchist and are some form of statist. But there you go. So that's my opinion there. Tell me what you thought. Was it a good opinion, a bad opinion? Do you have some thoughts of your own? Please leave them in the comments below. Do you think that my assessment of whether socialism and communism have been tried is correct or incorrect? I would be happy to hear that. So thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awiltus over and out.